Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Art of Cybersecurity series with 7 Rules Cyber. I'm your host and friendly CISO, Chirag Joshi, and here on the show, we try to simplify cybersecurity and speak in a language which all of us should understand because cybersecurity, as we know, is fundamentally a human issue that impacts all of us. On this show, we've been lucky to get a lot of great insights on wide-ranging topics from entrepreneurship, journalism, law, to career development, storytelling, and communication. So it's something that I'm really proud of, and you, the audience, have backed us throughout this journey and allowed us to get exciting guests and more insightful discussions. And talking of exciting guests and insightful discussions, today's topic is cyber risk management, which all of you know how it is close and dear to my heart. In fact, in my book, that was one of the first 2 rules: is cybersecurity is essentially risk management exercise. So it's something that's a core philosophy to me and something that is becoming more and more prominent. And the guest I have to discuss this with me, and I'm really excited to have him, is Toks Ojo. Now, Toks and I actually met at an Isaka event, which feels like a lifetime ago, but wasn't that long ago. And we discussed a few different things about what's happening in cybersecurity, cyber governance, and things that he's been leading in his role. So Toks is currently the executive manager for IT risk at MindSuper. He's had a very interesting career history. He's worked in the UK, here in Australia, in different roles from consulting to industry, in audit, risk management, and cybersecurity. So he obviously has a wide-ranging areas of expertise that I'm excited to talk about. The other thing, though, which excites me about this conversation is the culture that I observed when we had the conversations with MindSuper, an area where the CEO directly has a lot of visibility into cybersecurity, which is awesome to see. The right tone at the top. It's not relegated to being an IT problem, and which is why I wanted somebody to come and speak from the organization, and I was just the perfect person to talk to. So, Talks, welcome formally to the show. I'm so excited that you're here. I gave the audience a snippet about your experience, but there's obviously so much more. So maybe I'll hand over to you. Formal welcome. Tell us a bit about your story, and then we'll get into the discussion.
Fantastic. Hello, Chirag. Thank you for having me on the show. It's really good to be here. Yes. So in terms of my background, again, quite a varied story. I started out in consulting, so Big Four. That at the time, what was it called? Global Risk Management Solutions. So again, the maturity of the industry was a little different back then, and that evolved into systems and process assurance, which in short is IT audit, effectively. But working quite closely with management consultancy and kind of looking at some of the big SAP rollouts that were happening, so the security around that and moving to a more risk management point of view. So I started my career in the UK for a few years and then moved to actually to Switzerland for 3.5 years. And then back to the UK for a little bit, and then out to Australia. So, as a result, in those travels, I've worked in Big Four. I've worked for myself as a consultant. I've worked in industry, in internal audit, in risk management, and in cybersecurity. So it's been quite an interesting journey to bring me here. So yes, very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
That's pretty awesome. That's pretty awesome. All these different roles, and it just gives you unique insights, and you have that history, and you've seen the evolution of what we call IT risk or cyber risk management in this day and age, right? I mean, it has evolved so much from being just a compliance function. So maybe we just dive into that, right? As the
Yeah.
first discussion area, is the
Uh,
role of cyber. Sorry, talks you
no,
into
no,
your
go on, go on, go on.
I was going to say the role of cyber risk management. Now, I put my position on the show several times about how important that is, but I want to get your insights. How do you view the role of cyber risk management in your vantage point of all this experience that you have? But also,
Hmm.
how have you positioned it at MindSuper in your current role?
Okay. I would say historically it's changed. I think no one would be surprised to hear that, cyber before was cyber was information security and stuff that didn't sound particularly sexy. People weren't that excited about it, and it was very much seen as a business problem. Or sorry, an IT problem. It's a technology issue. It needs to be taken care of. Now, kind of showing some of my vintage here, way back in the day when Y2K was a thing. And I don't know if anybody remembers when that, and everybody thought the end of the world was nigh, the apocalypse would come early and everything would melt. And so there was a lot of work around, okay, what do we do to safeguard ourselves against the Y2K bug when everything's going to stop working? And there was a lot of fear mongering and a lot of work that was done. Consulting firms were busy, everyone was concerned. And then after that, there was that sense of, oh, the world kept turning. Okay, so that wasn't quite so bad. And you've had this swing from technology is going to be the end of us all to that wasn't quite so bad. And actually, maybe this isn't such a big deal after all. And then it kind of went perhaps a little back towards, oh, it's a technology thing. And then now I think it's evolved back towards an understanding that cyber it's another risk that we need to manage, and it's coming out of the kind of esoteric, deeply technical. There are things that we don't understand. We'll leave it to the specialists. To the business understanding that technology's role across the entire organization is very pervasive, and therefore you need to attend to it not as a specialist function of one unit, but actually something the whole business needs to understand. So I think perhaps the challenge, and it's an ongoing challenge, is really how to translate that into an understanding that this affects everybody in different ways, and your ownership of systems or even information and understanding of the regulatory framework that sits across all of that, as well as the increased use of technology and digitization. It just means that the exposure of every organization is a lot higher than it used to be. And it's evolving so quickly that you need to have some view on it. And in the same way, most businesses are very across their financial risk. Financial institutions are across their credit risk. A lot of other companies with a very high profile are very aware of their reputational risk. Cyber is just another risk that needs to be managed that touches on all of these things in a way that perhaps executives, boards haven't necessarily been as across, but now need to be just by virtue of the fact that it is so prevalent, it's so high profile, you can't help but need to understand it. And of course, every organization has a slightly different way of doing it, but its importance, I think, is universally accepted.
No, well said, and you are right. It is essentially a risk management exercise, and the more it is seamlessly integrated in the existing enterprise risk landscape, the better we are for it, right? Because it has the right taxonomy, the right visibility, the right reporting, and people understand that's one more risk that they need to manage. And I mean,
When you say seamless, I'm just like, okay, I think at some point there may be. I'll keep an eye out for this, the unicorn of seamless cyber integration into risk management. I think in theory there is the understanding that it should be treated as a risk, just like any other risk. The reality, though, is that again, you have on your boards in senior management, you've got people who are very familiar with finance, you've got people who are accountants, you've got people who are lawyers, you've got senior execs who are familiar with corporate governance and familiar with how businesses work in terms of it. But cyber is still making its way into, or rather, there is a large aspect of cyber, which I think is the translation from the technical to the this is something that we need to do. Because your traditional risk management is okay, what's the likelihood and what's the impact? These are traditional risk management framework things that people understand. But when you say, from a cyber risk point of view, what's the worst thing that can happen? You can say, well, this company won't exist in about 3 months' time. So everything is the worst that could happen. And that being able to extrapolate that to how do you quantify your risk in a way that you can actually say, well, if that were to happen, what would be the impact? And try not to make it sound as disastrous as possible, because you can almost take any cyber incident and go, what's the worst case that could happen? And so from your risk management point of view, your consequence is right up at the severe or the massive impact at one end of the scale. So it's like, well, if everything is a massive problem, clearly nothing is a problem. And so you have this challenge of how do you actually gauge that along with all the other competing priorities that exist. So, sorry, sort of diverting back from the seamless, I think one of the real challenges that cyber risk has, or translating cyber security into and through a risk lens, is how to make it understandable in a way that actually goes, now I have enough information on which to base a series of decisions. And those will be business calls. How much resources do I put to this? What do I drop in order to prioritize this? How do I put this into a coherent framework that the business can digest, understand, and continuously apply? So again, it's the kind of thing where seamless, I think the translation from what is technically a way of looking at the organization to here are a series of decisions that management and the different members of senior leadership need to be attending to
Yeah.
is perhaps the challenge that exists at the moment.
No, and you're right. And I think it's to that point, right? It's going to be, to me, it's all relative. When we think about the initial early days, you had this being an IT problem, and you had these in a risk register buried somewhere if you had a risk register and if
If
you're
you,
managing them, right?
yes.
So that was in itself a maturity indicator. But now to actually move to the point where we're talking about enterprise risk taxonomies, where you have rules coming out, and actually it's going to be quite interesting, and maybe something we'll talk about a bit is in the US. I'm not sure if you're following these talks, but the SEC rules
Mm,
that have come about around cyber risk management are quite comprehensive and actually require a significant uplift. And what
mm,
it means is organizations, the in-scope organizations, which is a lot of listed entities, they need to have a cyber risk management program that will be, disclosed in the annual filings. And I think that's such a
mm,
big maturity leap, because now that requires the sign-offs from so many senior stakeholders who actually need to understand before they sign it off, which means that needs to
mm,
be understanding. And here in Australia, as we know, APRA has been on it for a while, and now with the introduction of the SOCI, the Security of Critical Infrastructure, and those related, legislative requirements, it's another
mm,
aspect to it. So a lot happening, and maybe I think to that, maybe the next point I want to go us into is with all of this, right? And we'll talk about how you approach compliance requirements, because
mm,
that's a separate question I want to come to. But before
mm,
that, you brought up the area of making the translation between the business and technology and making it real to people, as
mm,
opposed to saying everything is on the higher end of the spectrum and a red or whatever. And you talked
mm.
about quantification. Maybe let's get into it. Are there maybe examples or your theory which you can share that will get some pragmatic insights as to how can people start the cyber risk quantification journey, or at least make it more real to their business stakeholders, right? As opposed
Mm.
to going down the super scientific route, which is good in theory, but it's just almost impossible for most organizations to implement, in the way they currently are structured. But maybe get you some practical insights in terms of the use cases, scenarios, or your own experience.
If we take patching, for example, like everyone goes, okay, fine, we've got patching, we must do patching. And everyone goes, yes, that's a great thing. And then you say, we need critical and high vulnerabilities need to be managed within this time frame. And so everyone goes, yeah, yeah, great idea, great idea. The challenge you then face is going, okay, so are we talking about operating system patching? Are we talking application? What are we dealing with here? And then it's like, okay, we've got this system where we've got, for example, you could have your monitoring and your threat intelligence coming in telling you, right, your Microsoft suite has these number of vulnerabilities and they are as such and they're all critical. And so everyone goes, oh, we've got this many criticals. We must do stuff with these things. Now, when you're reporting this, again, so as you go up the chain and the question becomes more of a business challenge is going, is this going to stop the business? Well, no, technically, but we've got a few holes in here that need to be patched. So is this something that we need to do right now? What exactly is it I'm patching? Oh, well, it's heartbleed. What is that? Okay, it's very easy to get pulled down into the specific details, and as you get close to the detail, you can see the eyes glazing because like this is outside my area of competence. As a senior executive, like just tell me, do I have a problem or do I not have a problem? The expectation is that patching is done, for example, in a timely manner. What does timely actually mean? Some people they'll say, "Oh, we do it absolutely as soon as we do it." I think one of the interesting things coming from, say, an audit background is looking at when people say, "Oh, our policy is that as soon as we have if it's a critical vulnerability, we patch it immediately." I'm like, immediately. Does that mean you do it, you stop everything and it goes immediately? Or does that mean you assess it immediately and then you try and see if it's going to break the business? And then you apply it in a reasonable rollout fashion, or you try and get an escalation to get it done in an expedited fashion. Oh, that's what we meant. So it's not immediate, it's more. It takes priority. And so that question of then going to the business, what does a critical vulnerability mean? Does that I take the Microsoft label? This is critical. Because when a business leader hears critical, they think, right, stop everything. This has to happen right now. And translating that into actually, they've been rated as critical. But we've now done our own assessment. If we look at the other mitigations we have in place, in fact, this is only applicable to on-premise applications. This actually isn't applicable to us. So we've got a critical number, but we can discard this many, and these are the ones that matter. Why do they matter? Explanation. We have a particular hole in this area, or we don't have any mitigations. Therefore, this is what could happen. Business call. So in some cases, you've got an expectation that it'll be done in a timely manner, but you really do have to work on why does this matter? And why does this matter to be dealt with right now?
Yeah, a great example, and I think it's a very pertinent case. Actually, when I was speaking at the Australian CyberCon last year in Melbourne, and our topic was, and my talk was on this area of patch prioritization. And
Mm.
as you dig deeper into it, it's a lot of times taking just CVE scores or CVSS scores or whatever
Mm.
scores without applying the right level of contextualization for your organization.
It
That's a
just gives you a
problem.
list of things. It's a problem because what you'll end up with is a very long list
Yeah.
with no way of actually parsing how much of this is relevant, how much of this is actually critical to the way your business is set up, and which needs to be handled in which particular order. So, and this is perhaps where the question of risk management comes in. They're
Yeah.
going, if you balance this against all the other things that are taking place, the mitigations that exist, and how hard it would be for that vulnerability to be exploited, does that mean it needs to be now? And I think part of the challenge comes in actually making that reasoning transparent. Going, okay, we do all these things because sometimes you'll have an overworked cyber team who are busy on the tools trying to just keep on top of all the things, and they're constantly dealing with not just here's an alert that's come up that I need to investigate. You'll get a request that comes in from some part of the business that really that's not a cyber issue at all, but they'll hear, oh, the technology team, you guys do stuff, and you're dealing with these different where you have to try and again the view that technology to serve the business, including cyber. So people getting pulled in multiple directions and sometimes going, this is important because X, this is not important. And then the question of looking back on it, going, how do you actually have something that it doesn't end up just being one person's diligence or one person's view versus this is our considered approach to dealing with these things because everyone's worked in a place where you've got someone who is absolutely on top of everything and they deal with everything like it's an urgent priority. They usually tend to work very late. They're quite stressed out and reasonably unhappy about the demands being made on them. They go off on holiday and everything slows down and everyone goes, oh, okay, it's not so bad. And what you struggle with is that if you ask this person who's working stupid hours trying to stay on top of everything, why do you need to do all these things? They'll give you one set of reasons. You'll ask the people that deal with it when they're on holiday why they deal with it in that fashion. You'll get a different set of reasons.
Yeah.
And what you end up with is a lack of consistency in the approach. And so having that view where you go, we take this approach and then everyone can apply it in a reasonably coherent manner. And I think you made an interesting point there about the assessment of it. Oh, well, you can't take it out of context. It's just a list that everything's high priority. And that level of skill and that level of actually exposure to this is what happens if you don't address this in a timely manner, or this is the extent to which this is actually not that much of a problem. Without that ability to pass the difference between them, you end up with a list where either everything's a priority or everything's on the backlog because you're too busy. And so being able to then go, this is why it matters, is a valuable exercise in actually that prioritization exercise.
Yeah, and absolutely, and I love it. I think that's such a that's such an insightful analogy that you brought up, right? About somebody working really hard, hair on fire, and then go and leave, and then things change. And I think that you actually are touching upon a broader point there. And I'm not sure if you've been following, but the increasing burnout we see in cybersecurity these days, you see the numbers are just rising.
Absolutely.
And look, there are reasons for it, right? And I'll never ever minimize it because it's a problem.
Mm,
However, what we choose to focus on, if that is aligned with the business and aligned with the risk appetite of the organization, we can
mm,
still get out of a lot of holes we find ourselves in. We
mm,
get involved in things we probably shouldn't. We we are trying to serve people who still don't understand completely what we do.
mm.
And we haven't spent the time in informing them, in my view, to the extent that it needs to be informed. And it's not an awareness session you walk away. It's actually helping them, upskilling them, because we keep saying cybersecurity is everyone's problem, but we haven't really made it real to people beyond clicking on phishing links and all those things. So I think that's where actually the point you just brought up. was really insightful in that context for me too. The other question I have, Talks, for you is, uh, at your approach now at mine, Super, where I know that you have a really solid culture and you have a lot of, good visibility and support. Uh,
Mm,
how have you approached, right? Because you built this program, you built this IT risk program. Uh,
mm,
what went into it? What were the building blocks of the successful programs? And
mm,
where do you see you picked up the wins that allowed you to get so much confidence from executive leadership? What did that look like? Because a lot of people are on that journey, and
mm,
hearing it from someone who's kind of been there and is doing that is
mm.
quite useful.
Okay. Firstly, I would say one of the most important parts of it is that whole question of tone at the top is actually a very strong risk management practice. So within the organization, we've got a very strong line two risk. So with that, the chief risk officer is very cognizant of the importance of cyber, and we also have a chief information and security officer who also understands the importance of this right the way from the top to the bottom of the organization. So starting off from the foundations, we have the support to actually pursue this as something that's relevant, the understanding of the risk implications and the budget and the executive support to make sure these things are put in place. Now, it does help that we're in a highly regulated industry as well. So financial services, we have a lot of regulation, and so it's not something that can just disappear or be shoveled. We have obligations that need to be met. We have regulatory compliance that we need to actually attend to. And therefore, in that context, you have a framework where this is important and can be. And of course, we have our internal audit and we have our external audit, all of whom are looking at information security and cyber as a key function, driver, and risk area for the business. So there's a lot of focus on that. And so in the middle of all of that, you have this understanding of, okay, how do we actually make sure that one, we're treating the risk, we've defined the risks almost like as a part of a material risk, your risk appetite statement, which is set by the board annually. Do we have all the relevant risks actually captured as material risks in the organization? Have we defined them properly? Are these understood? Does the board and the executive understand what these things mean? From that, then you have an enterprise risk profile. So again, this is the bit where you're coming out of the risk practice, going, right, we now have an enterprise risk profile for each one of the business units. These are the risks. Now, what controls exist in the business to mitigate these within appetite? And if there's a gap, what are we doing about it? And so again, you have a framework which is applied right the way across the business into which this fits or needs to fit. So the understanding that A, this is a material risk, B, it's reflected in the enterprise risk profile, and C, for each one of these risks, there needs to be a set of controls that will actually help mitigate that to meet the risk appetite state or the tolerance the business has and the appetite for risk in this particular area. So combination of zero tolerance for regulatory non-compliance, low tolerance for cyber risk. And again, that becomes a question of, oh, we're going to have zero tolerance for cyber risk. And it's like, let's talk from a risk point of view. What does that actually mean? That means we have no tolerance whatsoever. Therefore, we need to devote fully 50% of the annual budget to everything cyber. And therefore, it's like, no, actually, that's overkill. And it's not a good use as a super fund. Is that in the best financial interests of our members to spend everything on cyber? And it's like, no, it's a balance between all the things. So the appetite that is set, a low tolerance for cyber risk, zero tolerance for regulatory non-compliance, other things. You get a view on how can we best meet this appetite. So taking that and you go, okay, you mentioned before, the regulatory overlay that sits. So, for example, SOCI, the CPS 234 requirements from 2019, and the various different things that are coming in going, right, we need to be in compliance with this regulation. What does that boil down to? And you have the bit where your controls, how do you meet the requirements of all of these things? So again, it's not just, oh, we've got a cyber risk. It's like we have an information security or we have an information driven business. We have technology pervasive across the organization, and we have a number of things that we need to do. Now, expert or experience with being audited. So, for example, again, for my sins in a previous life, I've been internal audit and external audit, and again in consulting. So you've got a rough idea of what your IT general controls or general IT controls, or depending on which school of thought you come from, same thing. You know roughly what should be there. So you come in and you're going, okay, I'm expecting to see logical access controls. I'm expecting to see change management. There should be something about the way development is done, if anything. We now have the overlay of outsourced service providers. How are we managing the risk handled by vendors? And so you have all of these things and you have these frameworks they need to fit into. And what that does is it stops it being an exercise for one person who has to think of all of these things. I don't need to come in and write this from the ground up. There's already a structure into which this needs to fit. There are already requirements. So, for example, with CPS 234 compliance, when it arrived, it was, oh, everyone needs to be CPS 234 compliant. No one knew how to do it because it was new. But there were paragraphs that would actually give you these are the things, are the requirements per paragraph. So once you've gone past the definitions, you then start getting into how do we meet this? And then you had the practice guide, which gave you all the discussions and things that needed to be there. And if you go, well, how are we meeting this? And if you take it almost like a gap analysis, what do we have that meets the requirements of paragraph 13? Right. How are we communicating? How are the roles and responsibilities defined? Paragraph 14, how are these communicated up the chain? And then you start to look at what activities need to be in place. Because again, it's not always a control. It may be policy. It may be an activity. It may be a governance structure. How do we meet these requirements? And coming from the different regulatory requirements, I think you mentioned an interesting point earlier, meaning they're coming from the same place. The idea is that organizations take this seriously and they have a structure in which to consider how to approach it to make sure that minimum standards are met. So against that, you then have the question of how do we meet it? And it helps shape the thinking. So again, in our organization, there's understanding at the exec level as to what's important and why. There is an understanding that it's not set and forget, it's a continuous process. There are frameworks into which this activity needs to fit, and there are people who can understand and pass this from a technology section right the way up to the board. So these conditions make it, I'd love to claim that it's my hero points. I did this all from the ground up, but really it's a question of right the way across the organization. Do the structures exist that allow the right questions to be asked? Are the right people right the way from the executive and the board down to the people on the tools? Is there an understanding or a way of actually having these conversations where detail doesn't get lost and it doesn't become a technology thing? How are we meeting this risk? And it's that kind of question and that structure that allows a more consistent approach than perhaps I've seen in some other places.
And I think what you're mentioning there and talking about that is it's a few different points. One is cybersecurity or IT security or IT risk. The culture around it cannot exist in isolation of the organizational culture. So you need that organizational maturity, that tone at the top, and the right
Mm,
framework and structures, to your point, to operate within, right? And you need to then branch them out and engage with the right parts of the business, because otherwise, if you are trying to run the shop just in isolation with just talking to technology folks, you will never get the right answers without, because you lack the other part of the equation, right? You are just looking at it from a very confined point of view.
mm,
And you brought up a good point, and lots of good points actually, but one point which I wanted to take further was uh, what resonates in terms of the risk appetite? Because I
mm,
think risk appetite is a very, most critical thing as far as I'm concerned, because it dictates, the extent to which we go for things, but also often a very vague and a subjective exercise, if I may say so, especially
mm,
in cybersecurity. I'm not talking generally. In cybersecurity, I've seen very strange statements which are along the lines of we have low risk, low appetite for cyber incidents.
mm,
That says tells me nothing, right? To your point, what does that really mean? Do we have low
mm.
appetite for regulatory breaches? We have low appetite for, disclosure of, I don't know, 10 customer records? Do we have low appetite for for our external facing website to be unavailable for 30 minutes due to denial of service attack? What does that really mean? And I think
What it
that's
means, I think that's a really good question because ultimately, if we're talking at the risk appetite statement level and we're talking a board level document, this is the willingness of the business to tolerate flex in this area, arguably. So if we're gonna, the problem is it needs to operate at a reasonably high level of detail. So I would say in some senses, the discussion about what is our level of risk appetite in this area, you need to then define what does that mean for something that falls outside appetite? If you have zero tolerance, what it means is that anything and absolutely anything that falls outside tolerance requires immediate attention, all focus, everything gets dropped. There is no slippage allowed, and this will be reported at the highest levels from the point at which it occurs until the point it is managed to closure. End of, no discussion. And so it sounds like when people say, I've got zero tolerance, that doesn't necessarily equate to anything less than that is we're not taking it seriously, but it's how much of your organizational resources are you going to devote to it and in which time frame? Because if you have a low tolerance, it doesn't mean that you don't care. It just means that you go, we're also going to acknowledge the fact that some of these factors are outside of our control. You have a low tolerance for cyber risk, but you also have outsourced service providers for whom technology is a component of what they offer to you. And if there is an incident there, you have no control over that, but for your incident response patterns, your communication and vendor management with them that would alert you in a timely manner that something has gone wrong, and the mitigations you have in place. A zero tolerance means that could not happen, or we are not, everything has to stop if that happens. A low tolerance means we expect that there may well be incidents that are going to happen, and we will assess them and deal with them with urgency.
Yeah.
Because when you say zero, it's like it's not acknowledging the fact that this can't happen. Now, for an organization to say they have zero tolerance for we're not going to break the law. We have zero tolerance for being outside of the law and the requirements of the law. That's quite straightforward and simple. Well, let me take that back. It's not straightforward and simple. It sounds simple. It doesn't necessarily mean it's easy, but it's clear. When you say you have a low tolerance, the question then becomes, what does that mean? And actually having in your risk appetite statement, when we say low, what does that mean?
Exactly.
So, and that question there of it needs to be done, issue management will be raised, there's an expectation it will be reported on until closed, a reasonable time frame, it can be mitigated. Compensating controls are allowed, whereas if it's zero tolerance, no compensating, it must be fixed. And so when you look at that flex between zero and low tolerance, you're also allowing room for the pragmatic discussion with the business going, yes, we had to take on a vendor to provide this service. The vendor management technology risk assessment wasn't brilliant, but it was a choice between them and someone that was even worse. So you have that call where you have to make the business decision where we need this function or we need this service to be provided. They're not great. So what do we have in place to manage the risk? Because the risk, of course, still sits with us. But the question becomes one of how are you managing it? And so if it's within tolerance, you say, yes, we've got a low tolerance, meaning that we'll attend to it. We have structures in place and we'll manage it. We're not going to ignore it. You can't pretend it hasn't happened. You can't put it on the back burner and come back to it 6 months later. But the business must go on. And there is some flex for a risk acceptance where you go in the pursuit of a bigger goal, perhaps a strategic one, or in the absence of any other choice. We need to do this to meet our regulatory requirements or fulfill our function as a superannuation fund. They aren't great at a number of things, but in order to meet that, we sometimes have to put mitigations in place and accept that the risk is bigger than we would like, but we have these mechanisms in place to manage the risk to a point where it's tolerable. And it's that dialogue between how important is this to the organization versus how can we manage it in a manner that is it's not the Wild West. We have structures in place, we have ways of looking at it, and we have ways of coming back to it to make sure that if something does occur or it starts to get a bit wayward, we can see it in a timely manner and bring it in or put things in place to manage that. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think, and absolutely. So the level of detail is important, and what are we going to do about that is important. Now, the other question also is you need to ask yourself, and this is where my point is that a lot of organizations need to think about this deeply than they perhaps have in the past is, can you realistically, because if they all currently have a cyber risk profile, right? Even if they have done the work or not done the work, there's a cyber risk profile that exists inherently by the nature of the control maturity that they have and the threats they're exposed to. Now, if that is on the higher end of the spectrum, which can be in this day and age, and with the threat activity changing at a rapid pace, just by the nature of digitization that we have, a larger attack surfaces than we did in the past. We're adopting more technologies that we have. So with that velocity, you got to ask yourself a really hard question. Can I truly bring my risk down to low within what I define it as low? Or am I willing in the pursuit of my ambitions, because now everything is a technology issue, right? in terms of a business problem that is being solved by technology. A lot of it is. And
Mm,
when it comes to that, you now have a case where you probably want to live with a higher level of risk informed by the factors that you have, because otherwise the investment profile for you becomes so large to bring down risk to low or zero and stay there. Because,
mm,
unless you do that, what's the point? You bring it down to a certain point, again, it goes back up if you are not managing the maturity of controls. So I
mm,
think that's where, to me, you're right. I agree. It's something that needs to be deeply thought out. But I also encourage organizations to think long and hard about the terms that they use, because there are factors now that are outside of the control. You mentioned supply chain considerations. There are
mm,
considerations just within adoption of publicly available AI type tools like
mm,
ChatGPT example, Google's Gemini, pick whatever. People are using them. People will use them. You will now
mm.
have hybrid ways of working. So inherently, I think the threat has now increased to a level above what it used to be, which means that your controls evolve, or you are now willing to adjust your risk, because otherwise, with the same investment profile, you can only get so much for it. So,
Or maybe it's just a question of asking, for example, what is the threat environment in which you're working?
yes,
Because I think a lot of senior execs will go, oh, the cyber risk. Oh, there's just everything is cyber. And you're like, yeah, okay. But really, maybe 4 years ago, your working from home profile, the risks that you need to consider as part of the working from home profile were very different.
yes,
Post-pandemic, where suddenly you'll find the impact of working from home in workplace health and safety, people having setups that match what they have at work and they're safe around. That's just physically doing the work at home, and whether they actually have conditions that can be safe to do work in, things that you control as an organization in your office. But when you've got everyone working from home too, your IT investment profile, suddenly you're doubling up on the amount of equipment that you need to have and manage and patch and maintain, because people now need monitors and desks and all sorts of support. So you've got a massive outlay suddenly in terms of making sure your workforce can do their jobs properly from home, because not everyone has two monitors at home to do their thing. They may have the setup at home, but suddenly you've got this massive spike in the amount of equipment and suddenly the amount of carriage you need to have of things. You've got people with the internet at home where it's like, well, I've got a shonky internet connection that I'm sharing with a bunch of students. And at the moment, you've got so many different factors to take into consideration that now where you're going, oh, how are we going to secure the connection to our corporate network from someone's home setup? And then so you've got things where your threat assessment now needs to take into consideration a bunch of different things.
mm,
At what point, where does the edge of your network actually start? So in some places, you'll have things like always on VPN. How do you manage your risk of people working from home? Well, they're always tunneling in from VPN regardless. They can't bypass that. Therefore, the edge of our network starts when you try connect to it. There's no kind of, all right, we've got a different connection. So again, it really does. The threat profile has changed. Now, there are a lot more things that are online now, which means the question becomes one of how are we maintaining safety across all the different services that we consume? Are we taking a single sign-on approach? Are we insisting on the use of password manager? So there's so many different things. And I think the
yes,
challenge really is keeping on top of these. So you mentioned ChatGPT and generative AI as a challenge. Now, if we look at that in the context of superannuation, part of the business involves advice to members. Now, in terms of the regulation, who is actually qualified to give that advice?
mm,
Is it safe for them to actually go in, oh, well, what's the answer to this? And get a chat GPT answer and then go, okay, this should be good enough. I mean, you've seen loads of stories of people coming undone because they tried to find a quick answer for greater efficiencies and ended up with a hot garbage that's come out because logically it makes sense unless you actually know the subject matter. And so the question is less about is there a technology? What do we need to do? It's actually going, what's our approach
mm,
to this? How does this impact us and the area? And then if you've quantified the impact, how does this impact us? How could this be used? Then the question becomes, do we need to determine a policy on how it's used, if it's used, when
yep,
it's used?
yep.
Because you can't put the genie back in the bottle. That's happened. AI is out there. It's well. So the question for you is this something that's going to impact the way you do business? Is this something you need to be aware of? And again, this is where the risk management point comes in. You can't be across everything, but understanding how something will impact your organization and the world around you then becomes a question of, okay, so how are we going to manage that? Or how are we go, firstly, how does it impact us? Secondly, do we have a position on this? Why should we do something about this? Is this an area the organization needs to step into? And if so, what position are we going to take? And again, that conversation needs to go across the business going, why do we care? Why should I, the senior executive, not me per se, but anyone on, chief level, exec level, why do I care about this thing?
Yeah.
What is this thing? There are many, many things that they need to be across and they need to have a view on. Why is this thing important? And again, that translation from what's the risk to why should I act? And again, if we take just one step further from that, again, you've got your senior management and you have the board level, the director level responsibilities for cybersecurity. Again, these have also been brought to the fore going, it's not enough to say that, well, someone on the board knows cyber or I didn't know, you know? So under there have been numerous cases about the level of liability that directors have. You can't claim ignorance of a matter which is a material business part of, a material part of the business. You can't go, oh, well, I didn't know. You need to be across enough of the information to be able to discharge your responsibilities as a director. And part of that will be understanding what management is doing. So from the CEO down, below the line, arguably, the board level is governance. Below the CEO is management. How to actually get a view that management is fulfilling its obligations, management is handling the risks within the appetite you've set, and management is dealing with this in a manner that's appropriate. Therefore, as the governance layer, board of directors, you have enough information that you can use to determine whether this management is being done in a way that sits with the profile of the organization and the risk that you've said is acceptable. So it keeps moving across the different layers of management. So the question would be, is this important? Now, taking back to a question you mentioned before, how do we do it at mine? One of the things that we actually do is having a cyber paper that goes up to the Audit and Risk Committee on a quarterly basis. And so, again, in fulfilling that CPS 234 requirement, how do we make sure that material items are communicated and enough information is given to the members of the board they can understand how this risk is being managed and have a look at the indicators that would suggest that, yes, we're identifying things in a timely manner, and we've got appropriate treatments for it. And this is for your information, or this is something you need to be aware of, or this is something that has happened and changed, and therefore this is what we're doing about it. And that level of communication. So having that paper that goes up to the ARC every quarter is a way of us actually going, are we asking the right questions? Right, these are the areas. What's important for the board to know? And as it's going to the board, as it's going to the ARC rather, there's a level of oversight that goes, okay, senior leadership, what are we going to be presenting? How do we make sure that we're providing the right information at the right level of detail to stimulate the right kind of conversations? Because again, sometimes you could have the bit where you present a paper and everyone just goes, take it as read, move on. Again, from the regulatory point of view, we need to be able to demonstrate engagement with the board. We need to be able to demonstrate that they understand and they have a view. So inviting that kind of conversation requires you to present material that allows them to have that conversation. So taking one step back into the management layer, how do you determine what's important to provide? How do you filter the information so it's useful rather than just giving an enormous amount of data? You have to filter it. You have to consider your audience. What do they need to know, and how do you put it in a way that questions can be asked? And therefore, you ask yourself when you're pulling this information together, do we have the right answers? Someone's going to ask a random question, for example, again, generative AI. What are we doing about that? And it's a legitimate question. So as the threat environment evolves, and it does so rapidly, is that first line of one, are we informed of what's happening out there?
Yeah.
Secondly, does it impact us, or in what way can it impact us? And thirdly, what are we going to do about it? And lastly, how do we make sure that we can communicate this so that the rest of the organization understands what it has to do in this space as well? So it doesn't end up just being, as you say, a technology problem in a corner somewhere with somebody's hair on fire, stressing out, trying to do everything.
I love it. I love that decision making structure to it, right? And it all starts. And to be honest, far too often things get posed to technology or cyber risk teams. I almost think it needs to be turned around and ask, what does the business want to do with it, right? Like, what are the aspirations there? What's the business strategy with it? And then that allows us to bring in meaningful information. So it kind of goes both ways, I reckon. And
Mm.
respectful of the time, talks. This has been such a fun conversation.
You're right, we are
Doing this
running out
all
of
day, and,
time, aren't we?
it sounds like you could too. This is something very close to my heart, and obviously, I think it's a lot of great insights that you've been sharing, which is why I've just been listening in, and I think the audience will benefit greatly. There is though one discussion area that I want to cover before we formally close it out.
Mm.
And I'll be cheeky and bring in two things in that mix. Yeah. The
Okay.
first one is we talked about cyber threat profiling anyway, but
Mm.
formal cyber threat intelligence, I want to talk about that. The
Hmm.
importance of a threat management function to a cyber risk function, a
Mm.
good cyber threat management function. I don't just mean like, trends or whatever. I mean like contextualized good threat that is relevant to
Mm.
how the role that you see there, but also now because I want to expand that out because I know CPS 234 needs you to approach things from a cyber risk perspective, right?
Mm.
Proportionate, commensurate efforts. But CPS 230 is
Mm.
coming, and there are implications of that more so from an operational risk perspective,
Mm.
including supply chain. So I want to get
Yes.
your thoughts on the cyber threat aspect and then the impacts that it has on CPS 234 and then down the pipeline CPS 230.
Mm. Okay. In relation to the threat landscape and how we address it. So from the CPS 234 perspective, as you mentioned, the question of how is what you're doing commensurate with, how are you keeping across the changes to the threat environment? How do you make sure your controls and risk management is commensurate with the threats that are faced? And how do you make sure that these are tested on a regular basis? How are your security incident response plans aligned, determined, tested, and the results, cascaded down? I think there's a whole the challenge, I think what's good about CPS 234 is that it does bring all of these almost like subheaders. You need to consider this. How are you dealing with this? So, for example, it could just be, all right, we're getting threat news, still needs to be passed and understood. You could have a managed security service provider who gives you that these are things that you do. There are tools out there that go, these are all the vulnerabilities and the criticality rating, not just the score, but this is why, how, and what. You've got news feeds. I think the challenge is less about how do you edit, it's how do you actually filter that into a usable format because there's enormous amounts of information out there from multiple sources. Every consultancy will send you their latest and greatest package. These are our insights for the month. This is our thought leadership. These are the things you should be attending to. These are the conferences you should be attending, and this is what we're seeing at the moment. So everywhere you're inundated with enormous amounts of information. So the challenge becomes how do you pass that into a manner that allows you to take action from it? Um, that was part one. So I think there was one, and supply chain.
Supply
Ha!
chain and
That
CPS
vexed
230.
question. Right. Now, CPS 230, I mean, again, the question of what a critical operation is, I think it starts with definitions because CPS 230 has come and it's new for everyone. Not all of it is new. Again, the vendor management practices aren't new. The requirement or the need to actually manage your supply chain and your vendors and your third parties is not new.
Hmm.
This is kind of bundled up in a way, but the question of how you define what your critical operations are is something that's going to require a lot of thought because everyone will say, oh, this is all important. And then you go, but is it critical to the business? And applying that lens of criticality is really going to. Now, the challenge for technology, of course, is that all the technology that underpins all of these critical things, suddenly you'll find that your list of vendors that you consider to be material or significant is going to change because a lot more is going to fall into that area that you go, these are significant vendors because they support critical processes or critical operations. In turn, what that means is it's going to force an increased level of maturity in the assurance, third party assurance that's required. Because as you've probably experienced, some companies, the bigger ones, will have a trust center where they'll just give you, here's our SOC 2, SOC 3, and SOC 1 reports. And SOC 3 or they'll publish, but there's SOC 1 and 2, their ISO certificates, and various redacted versions of their DR, BCP, pen tests, and risk management. So it's the bigger ones. But then as you move down the scale to the size of the organizations, you may find you've got an ISO 27001 report, or not even the report. You'll have a certificate and you'll have to ask very nicely for a statement of applicability. And in some cases, you'll have best intentions because it's a small organization and they're actually just trying to get by. So the challenge, again, taking this back into the risk management arena, so to speak, is these are our key vendors. What assurance do we have? Because they're managing a process, handling data, dealing with critical processes, processing stuff on our behalf. What is our actual risk exposure for this vendor? Now, if we were doing it in-house, these are the controls we would expect, or this is what we'd operate. Now, from them, what answers can we get that would give us a view on how well or not they're managing the risk? And if so, what controls can we put in place? But some aspects which are within your organization's control. How do we view the risk profile of each of these vendors that we have to work with? You've got the vendor side, some of which are further along the line than others. So they have third-party assurance. A lot of contracts have a right to audit that doesn't get used, but nevertheless is there. And then lastly, how do you marry those two things to ensure that your engagement with this vendor sits within the risk profile of the organization? And that is an ongoing dialogue that needs to take place. But the structure, these are our key vendors. These are material. What does that mean? These are significant. What does that mean? These are tactical. What does that mean? What information are we sharing with them? What is the risk? And that whole, again, having a framework in which to understand these things helps because you can categorize and then you can approach in a systematic manner. But there is part of it that is outside of our control in that what's available in the market at the moment varies from organization to organization. So you almost have to pitch how much are we willing to deal with your vendor risk? How do we accept a situation where strategically we have to work with this organization, but their data handling processes aren't great? What can we do with that? So there's no one quick fix to this. And I think lots of different organizations are trying to manage it in a way that's sustainable because you can't have a full-blown 2-month audit every single year for every single vendor. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, and look, I think, Talks, we probably should do, if you're going to be willing and if you have time. I know you're a busy man. We should do a part two of this because there's so much I want to deep dive into. I mean,
Yeah.
I feel like we've talked for close to an hour, but I feel like there's so much more I want to chat about. There's so much I was thinking in my head. I haven't spoken about this because you brought up a great point about
A
supply
different,
chain risk, and there's a big
yeah.
issue there in the industry right now. And maybe I'll just share that, and maybe we close on that note. Is there is a lot of issue we have with the traditional security questionnaires that get
Mm,
hard in the names of an assurance. And I get it, right? You got to do something. So maybe that was a
yes.
crude way to get started. But we know these things aren't doing their job that we intend to. One, at the best, they're a point in time exercise, even if done perfectly.
Mm,
They're not dynamic in nature. They far too often put a lot of burden on the suppliers themselves, who are part of our ecosystem, by the way, they're partners, right? But also
mm,
the folks who send these out don't necessarily tailor them. So they might get these questionnaires and they might be satisfied, but how it is implemented in the environment, there is no architectural due diligence with some of these things either. So you can pass a supplier saying they're great, but how do they actually work in your environment? And that sometimes doesn't get thought about. So I think there is a bigger issue, and I think we should probably talk in detail at some point about supply chain security because I would love to get your thoughts
mm.
on that. There's so many elements to it.
Oh, absolutely. I think again, it's a whole topic unto itself and a
Yeah.
whole thing. But I think the question there's also what can you do?
Yeah.
And I think perhaps a follow-on question is what should you do commercially? What does that actually mean? Where does the line between what the vendor should be responsible for and they should take us? There's some bits where I've outsourced it because I don't want to know the details. I want you to handle that. And I need you to handle it in a manner that means that I'm comfortable with it. I don't need to get under the hood because I may as well be doing it myself if we're going into that level of detail. Anyway, this is another conversation, perhaps, but
Yes.
still, I think it's a very interesting area. There's so much here, and it's evolving constantly with the amount of technology or the speed at which technology is evolving and the way people are outsourcing particular functions and trying to keep on top of their business and move things out. It just means that your vendor management area, so to speak, is constantly moving and is bigger than perhaps it's ever been. So
Yes.
there's a lot more of the focus on what used to be technology problems in-house. We've got a technology team and a bunch of servers in-house or in a data center. Now you've got vendors providing you a service and you're asking the question, well, they're sitting on Azure or they're sitting on another platform. So how are we getting comfortable with different layers that they're offering? And more to the point, should I be going into that level of detail or should I contractually oblige them to provide me with a service that operates in this fashion with these safeguards? And therefore, in the event something goes wrong, the liability lies with them because they're not providing the service in a manner that was contractually required. Now, of course, you don't want to wait till the contract looks like it's being violated before there's a problem. But the question of how much you want to be involved in that is something that's still up for debate. But you're right, we're out of time, and I could go on about this for a very long time.
Absolutely, and we should do that. So the good teaser for our audience in terms of our next discussion area. Toks, massive thanks to you, and I mean this sincerely. You've given us so much of your time and shared candidly so many insights, and I like the fact that it's all pragmatic, it's not theoretical, and something that everyone can take away. And depending on where they are in their maturity journey, start to put the pieces together. And in the show notes, we'll include information about your talks, and if you want to share, the best way for people to reach out to you, we'll include a link to your LinkedIn profile as well. And I want to thank the audience. Thank you for the support that you provide us. And I always tell, if you like what we do, please support us and subscribe to the channel. That helps bring in exciting more guests like Toks that we have here. All right, folks. See you next time, and thank you again, Toks. Really appreciate the time you've given us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a great conversation. Thanks, Chirag.
Thank you.